Good evening and welcome to another session of the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra's Virtuoso. I'm William Intriligator, music director and conductor, and joining me today is our principal percussionist, Colin Constance. Welcome, Colin.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
We are looking forward to hearing you perform and hearing a little bit more about your life and the instruments that you perform here with the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. Tell us a little bit about yourself first, where you hail from originally, how old you were when you started playing music, things like that.
Yeah, sure. I'm originally from Lawrence, Kansas. Born and raised, went to the University of Kansas, which is located there. Spent my first 26 years in that town. It's a great place. I started playing percussion in sixth grade as an 11-year-old. I decided as a second grader that I wanted to do percussion, mostly because I would sit in the family van. My mom would be cranking oldies. Both my parents were into more what we can consider like art music. My dad likes opera a lot, certainly classical music. I remember seeing it on Looney Tunes all the time and just really liked all music, and I was captivated especially by rhythm and drums. So as a second grader, I decided this is something I want to do. And at the time, the school district I went to wouldn't start band until fifth grade, but they also had a requirement where you had to have 2 years of piano lessons before you could start percussion specifically. Oh. So I was 3 years out at that time, and my parents figured, well, let's just go ahead and start. And so I did. And to be quite honest, I didn't really love the piano, but I moved through the lessons because I needed to get my other goal realized. And unfortunately, the year I was going to start fifth grade band, the school district cut beginning band at fifth grade level and then started it in sixth grade. It was still in the grade schools at the time. So I just continued piano for another year. So I actually had 4 years of that before percussion formally started for me. And then my parents made me do another year of piano. And then the year after my fifth year of that, they gave me the choice, do you want to continue piano or maybe focus more in on percussion? And I chose just percussion, ditched the piano for a while. As I'm older now, I slightly regret that. I'm pretty clunky and mechanical at piano. I wish I'd kind of maintained it a little bit more, but I had kind of grown tired of it and I wasn't really interested in it in the first place. So when junior high and high school came around, I really took off with percussion exclusively. And then I did a music education degree at the University of Kansas, and then taught for a few years, actually commuted from Lawrence to a suburb in Kansas City, taught grade school music, as well as I was the beginning choir director, which is interesting. Did that for 3 years, and then all along I had been planning with my advisor at KU to become like a percussion education specialist, and so he recommended do the music ed undergrad and then hit a percussion performance degree for my master's work, and that's what ended me up in Colorado State University, which is a really great program. It's still growing immensely today. I was the graduate teaching assistant for the studio, also taught the drum line. I was also a music theory TA for one semester there. And after I graduated from CSU, I ended up just moving down to Denver to put together a freelance career in music. So that's kind of how I ended up here specifically, which it's a great place to be. I came for the grad school work and then stayed because of the opportunities. And it's also a great lifestyle in this part of the country, which is not a bad deal either.
Absolutely. Wow. I really enjoyed that whole background, and I had no idea about some of that with you. I imagine that a lot of other orchestral percussionists might have no piano in their background. And so even though you had maybe 4 or 5 years and you wish you had had more, I bet that's really served you well over the years, huh?
Oh yeah, and it makes sense when you think about the challenges of percussion. Piano makes you read in 2 clefs, bass and treble. We do that as percussionists. You have to have foot coordination to work pedals on pianos. We see that in the vibraphone, of course, drum sets. The ability to really just spend a lot of time with any instrument develops your ear. And so when you think about being able to navigate the keyboard for mallet percussion or getting a good ear for tuning timpani drums, all those things really, really help. I think part of it too is that in percussion, I found that to be successful, even if you have great instruction and a great band director, which I did growing up, you still have to have a sense of independence and resourcefulness and resiliency and drive to be able to do it, because there's so much going on with all the different instruments that you can't just expect to be spoon-fed everything. So I think that the school district wanted to see you not just get those musical skills, but that you've shown a commitment that you're willing to push yourself, because it's inevitably going to be part of the success as a percussionist.
Right, right. Now, I have a question. During that whole time growing up in your teenage years and everything like that, you were always focused specifically on orchestral or band percussion and never a drum set, rock and roll band, or anything like
Oh,
that?
well, I should say I did a lot of drum set
Oh,
as
dear.
well, and I was really big into marching band drum line too.
Oh, yeah.
Um, so when I got to the high school level, they had the jazz bands, they had the marching band, and so I found myself getting even more captivated by the opportunities, because concert percussion is great, and I love it today. But the drum set and the drum line, you get a lot more notes to play, and it's a little bit more engaging. So I did a lot of drum set. In fact, when I was still in the Kansas City area, I did a lot more performance on drum set specifically. I was in a band, we played a lot of gigs. I was also part of the basketball pep band at the University of Kansas. And if anyone knows anything about KU, they think basketball is huge. So that actually were some of the biggest performances I've ever had. I mean, that field house would fill out every single game with 16,000 plus people. And you're sitting there on a drum set in the middle of the field house. So that was definitely a big part of, in fact, drum sets why I wanted to get started in percussion in the first place. But then once I started experiencing concert percussion, that became another part of what made me really excited about the opportunities.
Fantastic. Now, tell us a little bit about some of the other organizations that you work with here in the Front Range area, and about your teaching too. I mean, you are a natural teacher, I have to say, and such a wonderful, that's a great, wonderful quality to have in our principal percussion role, because you kind of have to oversee a bunch of your colleagues as well. But tell us a little bit about some of the other organizations and other opportunities that you're working at here in the Front Range.
Sure. Yeah. As I mentioned, I work as, my technical title is Scholastic Specialist for a music store in the Denver area. Some people would call that an education rep, where I'm really more of a liaison to the area schools. We have a really strong service and education-oriented program here. It's more than just selling instruments, and that's the reason I work at that shop. In addition to that, of course, I'm doing a lot of other performance. The Cheyenne Symphony is just one group I play with regularly. I'm the principal percussionist for the Steamboat Springs Symphony up in the mountains here. Also a section percussion member with the San Juan Symphony based in Durango, Colorado, and also Farmington, New Mexico. And then also with a kind of a semi-professional orchestra, the Denver Philharmonic. In addition to that, of course, I'm doing substitute work with other groups. I frequently play with the Larimer Chorale, Fort Collins Symphony, played with Greeley Philharmonic, and a few others, festival orchestras, things like that, that are pretty big in the summertime. So there's definitely a demand. As you know, in percussion, it's what we call feast and famine. Some tunes have zero percussion, and then others have like 8 parts. So we got to come in and fill the sections out, and an orchestra is not going to hire 8 percussionists as members of the section. You got to fill it out, and so we get to take advantage of those roles. As a teacher, I teach at 2 high schools in the Denver area, Bear Creek and Englewood High School. My jobs there are to write music for the percussion section for both their marching band and their competitive winter percussion ensembles. I also do a lot of coaching with their concert band percussion. And now a bunch of other odds and ends. I'm actually assistant band director technically at one of those schools, so I'll take on some duties for the band director when the need rises there. So it definitely keeps me busy, but I like the variety of work for sure.
That's so great. You know, that's one of the things that an orchestral musician has to be willing to do these days, right? Is to go where the jobs are and wear a lot of different hats and teach and perform. And I mean, as a percussionist, you're maybe wear more hats than normal, because compared to some of the other players in the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra, you play more than one instrument. I mean, you play endless amount of instruments when you're playing with us. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what we're going to see you perform and learn about here in just a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be looking at 3 different instruments. in part, there are things that I have at my home to be able to practice on. As I mentioned earlier, not having my own timpani makes that kind of tough. But I thought it would be good to show three categories of percussion. Generally speaking, you're going to have your mallet percussion, you're going to have your drumming percussion, and then your accessory percussion, which is just kind of a catch-all for all the kind of smaller or more uncommon instruments that happen. So I looked first at the Mozart Magic Flute Opera Glockenspiel excerpt. Then I look at the snare drum from Scheherazade. And then finally, I just talk a little bit about tambourine in general. But I think those are all really representative. And these are instruments, you know, any orchestral percussionist is going to have an in-depth study of all three of these categories to have a chance to be successful in a very, very competitive industry. I know some players that are smoking mallet players, but then you hand them drumsticks and maybe they're not so effective. And it really is a mark of success. So I think the video shows you a little bit of insight of where we have to focus our time and all the various abilities we have to have.
It's amazing, actually. The amount of, well, the sheer number of instruments that you have to play at such a high level, and the different techniques and styles, even just within one instrument, is amazing. Yeah. So I found, you know, this is just going to be so exciting for everybody to hear and to learn more about. I think you're going to be performing one of my favorite parts from Mozart's Magic Flute Opera. This happens in Act 1, where Papageno is, it looks like he and Pamina are trapped by these slaves, and Monostatos, this sort of evil guy. And then Papageno plays his magic bells, and all of a sudden these angry slaves who are about to attack him, and Monostatos himself, the sort of villain of one of the villains of the opera, all of a sudden the sound of the bells like turns them into just sort of like, I don't know, it's like it casts a magic spell over them. And das klinget so herrlich, das klinget so schön. And they're singing, that sounds so amazing. It sounds so beautiful. It's like a sound they've never heard of before. And actually you're about to explain it. Tell us a little bit about, I know you're going to explain it in a minute, but tell us a little bit how that was a very, very new instrument.
Yeah, Mozart, you know, he didn't really write a ton of percussion in the first place. And so it's interesting to see that he was the first. And this is according to all the written history we have. Sometimes you uncover these old manuscripts of, oh, there actually was this little bell part that just says ad lib playing in some obscure opera. But yeah, he was the first one to formally use it. And for many, many years, the Glockenspiel was actually like a keyboard mechanism. So it'd be kind of the most common instrument we have today would be like a cellist. The keyboard player would play in the orchestra. I found it kind of odd that it, just through, I guess, tradition's sake, I'm not sure exactly why, but it just kind of fell in the percussion section to play that part instead of handing it to the keyboard player in the orchestra. But that was the standard for many years. When they started to devise the glockenspiel and other mallet instruments, there was all sorts of weird prototypes, people thinking that they had a better idea how to lay out the keyboard. There are versions such as a diamond-shaped keyboard that you play kind of away from yourself, I guess, similar to if you see like really old marching glockenspiels where they wear it like a vest and they play this way. But finally they decided through a bunch of trial and error that they're just going to stick with the original kind of keyboard layout that had already worked for harpsichords and other instruments like it. But it took a while to get accepted. I think in part the marching bands that arose from, you know, European brass bands in the late 1800s, early 1900s, started to gain popularity, and so people just kind of accepted that as the version of the glockenspiel, and today that's all you see. In fact, keyboard glockenspiels, if you find them, are probably sitting just in museums. I've never actually personally seen one myself.
I haven't either. I've been to a lot of museums to look at musical instruments, like at the Met in New York and other places. I wish I could see that, because according to accounts, Mozart played it himself on that keyboard-like instrument, that bell part, and I've never seen what it actually looked like. I wonder if it looks a little like a small celesta. I don't know.
Yeah, I imagine so. I'm not quite sure, to be honest.
And then you were telling me earlier that you actually did a lot of your graduate thesis was on a little bit something like this. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I did two different oral defenses for my master's degree, and one of them was on how composers over the years started to apply not just specific instruments into the orchestral percussion section, but also started to write for specific techniques. And it's a really slow process. We know that percussion had been around for a long time through things like murals and like iconography. Basically, we see that that's happening, and there are old manuscripts that show in music to just ad lib a tambourine or a drum part, but there was not actually a formally written part. In the year around 1600, when opera took off, the timpani, which had been around for many, many years at that point, became a formal addition. Actually, you started to see people like Claudio Monteverdi start to actually write specific parts for the drum. Into the 1700s, this is actually one of my separate orals defenses, was on the specific element of the Turkish military, their Janissary bands, which were kind of like the Sultan's like private elite force and guard. They had famous instruments like cymbals, drums, tambourines, triangles. Their use of the instrument in the military setting became part of the orchestra after there was a battle. There were several battles in Vienna, Austria, that had a lot of strife between European mainlanders and the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
In one of those sieges of Vienna, the Europeans finally prevailed to a satisfactory level where they could safely think that the threat from Turkey was no longer. And so prior to that, to embrace anything that was Turkish would be to look like you were consorting with the enemy. And after they quelled that threat, all of a sudden, the Turkish things became really popular. And so there's actually a lot of places you can read about what was called Turkomania, which affected cuisine and architecture and fashion and music. So now it was okay to play tambourines and the timpani more frequently. And then eventually composers in the 1800s, the Romantic era was huge for getting composers to unmarry those instruments from just being a military or Turkish sound and being on their own an integral part of the orchestra. And it continues to today. I mean, there's still new percussion instruments being invented. I think the most recent, probably popular one would be those they're called hang drums. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're sort of like modified, I guess you could call them like a steel drum that's played like with hands on like a disc-shaped thing. Those are really pretty recent inventions that are gaining a lot of popularity, and who knows where the future will take us. But it's really fluid and really in depth, and that's something that's always captivated me, because we play these instruments and you just assume they've always been there, but they haven't. And somebody had to write a significant instrument and instruct players how to do it to be able to make it part of our regular world as percussionists.
That's so interesting. It's like the whole evolution of the orchestra and how more and more instruments got added, and the percussion instruments. It is a really interesting history. I'd love to read your thesis. Should we get right into your performance now?
Sure, yeah, that'd be great.
All right. This is Colin Constance, our principal percussionist with the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. Enjoy.
The excerpts I'm going to look at today, I've chosen for a few specific reasons. First and foremost, it's what I have available to me in my home. Normally, I'm used to being able to play on instruments provided by the symphony, as well as the high schools I teach at, things like marimba, timpani. I don't own those myself. Also, these will sound somewhat decent in my ad-lib recording studio. I will hopefully avoid the bird chirps. I've been fighting some birds outside the window here. It kind of sounds pleasant, but FYI, I apologize. Thirdly, though, this is a nice range of instruments that represents the various skills we need to have as concert percussionists. I'm going to be looking at the glockenspiel, also known as the orchestra or concert bells, the snare drum, as well as the tambourine. The glockenspiel I talked about already a little bit with the maestro, the historical aspects of it. This version is somewhat new compared to the older keyboard style glockenspiels, which are really quite hard to find. The resulting issue, though, is that the keyboard style instrument with all the 10 fingers able to play lots of notes makes it harder for us as percussionists to do the same. So we have to invent things like 3 or 4 mallet technique, like in the Pines of Rome, to play that effectively, or various sticking patterns and practice strategies to be able to play accurately lots of notes in a short amount of time. The magic flute, of course, as an opera, has one other magic instrument, the magic bells. They're played by Papagayano as a way to create safe passage on its journey. And you can hear it really prominently towards the very end of Act 1. This is the first piece ever written for the glockenspiel, which I think is very interesting. And in fact, it took another 50, 60 years for the next thing to come along. I think it was Wagner that started using the bells, and now we see it as a standard. But at some point, we had to slowly add that as part of the section. This instrument also is going to use really specialty mallets. These are the magic flute mallets made by Equilibrium Percussion, which is actually founded by Michael Udow, former professor of percussion at the University of Michigan. He now lives down the road in Boulder County in Colorado, which I find interesting. But these mallets are skinnier in width, shorter in length, and have really small beads made out of brass. All of these things designed to create a dainty, magical, almost fairy-like sound, which we'd expect from something like Magic Bells from the opera. It sounds like this. To play that really effectively, I have a few different strategies that are important. Mallet percussion is one of the hardest instruments in terms of pitch accuracy because of what I call the disconnect. In other words, every time I come to the instrument and come away, my perspective of where exactly the notes are changes. Add into that things like foot shifts, for example, especially on larger instruments like the marimba or the vibraphone, and I have to really be ready to adjust. Also, every instrument is a little bit different. Every mallet set is a little different. So all these things make it hard to make it accurate. In fact, this is a Musser glockenspiel, but it's a different model than the Musser glockenspiel that the Cheyenne Symphony owns. So I really have to use a couple strategies to help myself. One of those is to practice at really slow tempos. Muscle memory is great because it helps you to get over the hump as you're learning and becoming familiar with new music. The problem is muscle memory is actually the enemy of really refined performance. So I'm going to grab my metronome, something I practice with religiously, and I'm going to go at half tempo. This is going to be 45 beats per minute compared to the normal roughly 90 beats per minute that excerpt is usually played at. I'm not going to do the whole thing because it's pretty long, but you'll get the idea. By removing that normal tempo and having so much space between the notes, I have to know more up here as well as visually where my pitches are located. The other thing that does for me is it lets me improve my tone and phrasing. I'm always looking for a really clear, clean, singular attack when I hit those bars to get that bell tone quality that we all expect. It also gives me a chance by slowing it down to better understand the line or the shape I'm trying to create with that melody, especially in a solo such as this. Another strategy I'm going to use is to play it single-handed. Now, I'm not going to sort of cheat and let my extra hand kind of ghost note or gesture those motions. I'm going to hang my right hand to my side completely, let my left hand do all the motion. I'm going to go back to the normal tempo to give you an idea what that looks like. Once again, I'm not able to use muscle memory in the same sense because I don't have the same full package of motion happening. Additionally, it's going to help me work on a little bit more abstract rhythms, and it's going to allow me, by being able to focus just on that one hand, maybe some technique errors that might be present whereas I don't notice that doing both hands together. So those are a couple strategies that are really helpful. I would also use those on the snare drum, but I'll show you a couple other things that make this instrument really, really work. First and foremost is to get the right kind of instrument. Just like the mallets I'm using on that glockenspiel, I'm going to be using for the Scheherazade Movement 3 some sticks with really small beads because I want a delicate, small, articulate sound. I'm also going to be using a drum that's a little bit narrower and shallower as well as heads that are thinner than you maybe have on a standard orchestral snare, and certainly like on a drum set snare drum. Now, those snare guts are there to make the sound initially deeper, more articulate, louder. If I take the snares off and play, sounds okay. Turn those snares on, you'll notice an immediate sound change, but as well that, again, that thicker, deeper, articulate, louder sound. Now, I'm using a chamois cloth here for this excerpt, mostly to help it sound decent in this recording, but nonetheless, it's going to thin my sound out even more as I play such a quiet volume in Scheherazade Movement 3. To play this effectively, I'm going to actually use another little trick. Now, on the mallets, I'm playing the melody there. I don't have to necessarily think that along in my head. But on snare drumming, I don't have a pitch-oriented instrument here. So something like the duet in Scheherazade with the clarinet, I'm going to actually sing, whistle, sometimes I hum that sound out to make sure that I'm really lined up with the shaping and phrasing and balance with that player. Now, that certainly helps to shape the line, but the meat and potatoes of drumming comes down to rudiments. Rudiments are essentially the vocabulary we use to create longer lines of music. And rudiments, there's officially 40 of them, but they've been around for many, many, many years. I think they were formalized into 40 rudiments about 100 years ago. But even going back into Swiss drumming, the people that invented the snare drum, they were using rudiments back then. Even today, rudiments are still being invented. Some of the more popular ones have some wacky names, such as cheese de chuddas. That's right, cheese. Also, grandmas. But the 40 official rudiments are a collection of different sounds to create, again, that line. One category are sticking rudiments. In other words, combinations of rights and lefts, the paradiddle being the most famous. Right, left, right, right, left, right, left, left, paradiddle, paradiddle. Those sticking combinations not only create, again, line or phrase for the drums, but they can also help with things like glockenspiel, drum set, timpani. When I need to maybe turn around my motion to go up or down in pitch, having a double left or a double right is going to allow me to get that turnaround to happen. Another category of rudiments are what are called ornamentations or embellishments. These are going to sort of thicken up a sound. A regular tone can sound thicker with a flam, where I add a little grace note, even thicker as a rough or a drag. And again, the end of Scheherazade Movement 3, we see some really quiet drags, which are really fun to play. And a final category, which I want to look at, are roll rudiments. A roll in percussion is the illusion of sustain or duration by lots of frequent notes. Some of our instruments, like a vibraphone, have some sustain to them naturally, but a lot of them, like a snare drum, are very short sounds. So we create this illusion to make that length happen. It's also unique sounding itself and is worth using them just for that purpose alone. On a glockenspiel, if I played a roll, I would use a single stroke roll, which is just a quick alternation of the mallets, like a dinner bell going off. You see that most commonly in percussion, bongo drums, timpani, suspended cymbals especially. Drumming doesn't use that too much, or at least in snare drums, I should say. Instead, we use two different kinds of rolls. One is the buzz roll, also known as the multiple bounce or closed roll. Another excerpt from Scheherazade Movement 3. Also in that excerpt, I used an open stroke or double stroke roll, specifically a 7-stroke open roll. If you listen closely, there are 7 individual hits, but notice I didn't motion 7 times. What I did was a 2-for-1 stroke, where it's one gesture into the drum, as those 2 sounds. This is really common, especially in rudimental drumming like you see in a marching band's drum line. So those are all going to help me to play the parts, not just in Scheherazade, but many different types of solos, etudes. They're really important to being able to create, again, shape and line and embellishment in a snare drum part beyond just playing the core rhythms that, of course, we also have to do quite a bit of. The final instrument I was going to look at is the tambourine. And the reason I chose this is because it's sort of underrated. A lot of accessory or auxiliary percussion is so commonplace and they're small and simple. We tend to not give them as much credit as we would more difficult drums and mallet instruments. But this is such an important instrument in part because it's worldwide and it's ancient. You can see Greek pottery with pictures of people with the tambourine. And across the globe, there are people, even especially like in the Middle East, that are tambourine players professionally that really just play this one instrument, of course, with different names in different sizes, different shapes, different amounts of jingles, some with heads, some without. But it's a really universal instrument, which I think is pretty cool. It connects us with the bigger percussion community. Now, a tambourine, of course, is not that hard to make a decent sound without much effort. Not hard, sounds good. But to play it with a refinement and an expertise is what I wanted to show you today. Now, I already mentioned rolls. Now, the tambourine is a little different because we have two different types of rolls that are pretty unique to this instrument. One is the shake roll. That's just a quick alternation of the wrist back and forth, like you were trying to jiggle a doorknob that's stubborn, for example. Now, the key there is to make sure that I have a balance of motion and angle so one side of the motion doesn't sound heavier and separated compared to the other side. Another type of roll is the thumb or finger roll. These are lots of fun to play. Once you get good at it, it takes a little bit of time. The idea is that you're going to use your finger or thumb to sort of skip across the head like a rock being skipped across the surface of a pond. Sounds like this. I use that to create lighter sounding rolls as well as shorter sounding rolls. Theoretically, if you can do a finger roll on a tambourine, you also can effectively do it on lots of other instruments. For example, I should be able to get it on the snare drum, or maybe the bells. These don't work quite as well because they're not as resonant and vibrating. A little bit there. It sounds really cool, especially on a concert bass drum. Sort of sounds like a whale call, which is a lot of fun. To help myself out, a couple tricks. One is the angle of the tambourine, as well as where I'm playing on the head. And I'm going to add a little bit of beeswax to the side. And a lot of times I actually wet my finger with some moisture just a little bit, because again, that's going to help me create some friction. As I push down and out, it sort of pulls on the skin underneath the fingernail. That's the basic idea. As I hop across, of course, a normal roll is going to connect that more consistently. A few of the things to think about with the tambourine are the type of tone and depth that you want to make. If you're playing kind of louder sounds, you're going to play on the head. And you can hear a little bit of sustain from that head ringing after contact. But what if I had to play some really quiet sounding music? What I can do is invert the tambourine. I'm going to put the head against my leg. I'm going to put my gut up and over the edge of the back side of the tambourine. I'm going to play just with some fingertips over a single set of jingles. For example, a Spanish rhythm right there. So it gives me a lot of range of sounds as I need to be able to adjust across the varying repertoire of the orchestra. One last thing I'll leave you with is the hand-knee technique. This is heard, for example, in the Nutcracker Russian dance Trepak. This is used when you have to play medium or loud sounds but fast rhythms. I'm not going to grab mallets or drumsticks and hit the side of my tambourine. First and foremost, it's going to destroy my tambourine. Secondly, it makes a kind of unpleasant sound because you get a lot of what's called contact noise. You're going to get a clicking sound of that wood on wood. So instead, I'm going to play on the top of my kneecap with my other hand in the center of the head. So in the Trepak sound, I'm doubling that rhythm on the tambourine, but I can only do that with this special sound because eventually I'm going to run out of chops to be able to play that just single-handedly fast enough. So it's a really fun technique that I like to show people and help them learn that things like the tambourine or castanets or triangle, though they're small, though they are more simple, they have a lot of depth behind them, and I like to educate people and entertain them a little bit with some of those tidbits. Thanks for watching. I hope this was informative to you, and I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about what it takes to be an orchestral percussionist.
Bravo, Colin. You really are an amazing musician, a great performer, a virtuoso, as well as a great teacher, as we've seen from that really instructive explanation that you gave us about the glockenspiel, snare drum, and tambourine. Thank you. Bravo.
You're welcome. I appreciate it. It was a pleasure for me to introduce that to. I think we see a lot of times the music itself and the performances themselves are great, but having an informed approach, I think, makes it even more captivating when you get to go then see those in real live performance.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure many of our audience members who were watching are never going to watch the Tchaikovsky Nutcracker Trepak without staring at you for that tambourine. That is so
Yeah.
cool what you do with
Well,
your knee.
when we famously in Cheyenne, we famously will often double that tambourine part. So you got the choreography element that's gonna go on back there too, in addition to the unique playing. So that's always a lot of fun. Since
Yeah,
that's such a frequent piece we play.
it is. Yeah, that's my own little quirk to always ask for that part doubled. You know, sometimes with percussion, it does make a difference. And although it's not necessary to add more, sometimes it's exciting. One time, I'll share you a little funny story I did. One time I was doing Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony with another orchestra, not in Cheyenne. And there are all these amazing cymbal crashes. It's famous for the cymbal crashes. But to get to the most climactic moment, after a lot of other cymbal crashes, there was this one part where I asked for the cymbal crash to be quadrupled.
Yeah.
So that 4 percussionists all do the cymbal crash. It was actually visually so exciting, even as much as it was orally as well. I don't know if you've ever done that symphony or done it that way before, but sometimes conductors like me, we get a little indulgent with things like that.
I've seen Hector Berlioz in the early Romantic era was a big percussion proponent, and his mass. There's a YouTube videos you can see where like I think it was like 8 cymbal players, and it's just ridiculous because they're all getting back there strapped up, ready to go, and the whole, like you said, the visual component to it is almost as impressive as its own sound. So yeah, I've seen that here and there. It's pretty amusing.
It's great. A few of those things I stole from other conductors that I've seen, but one of them I stole it from was Sir Simon Rattle, who himself was a great orchestral percussionist. So I thought, okay, if he's doing that, I think it's a little bit legit.
Great. I love it.
Yeah. Colin, we are so blessed to have you in the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. I wish that, like you said, I wish we could have percussion at every concert. You know, it's just, there's so much great music that was written before percussion was an integral part of the orchestra. Right. But if I had my way, we'd be featuring you and your colleagues in the percussion section a lot more. And we can't wait to get back together and perform with you and for our audience.
Yeah, I'm excited for it for sure. And it's just the thing that we accept as percussionists, feast and famine. And because we don't want to not have all that great music from prior to, the Romantic era. You got to play that stuff too. So it's just something we accept and we deal with it. So
yeah. Well, it's been great getting to know you better. And thank you so much for your beautiful performance and explanations tonight. And I'm sure everybody's going to be looking forward to seeing you at our next orchestral performances with percussion, and maybe even seeing, coming up backstage and saying hello and thanking you for this. This was really great, Colin. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And to all of you tuning in, we really appreciate your ongoing support of the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. We are working hard and meeting with our board and staff so that we can try to perform for you again in a safe way as soon as possible. So stay tuned, and we'll let you know when our performances will be coming up again. And also in the meantime, we wish all of you to be healthy and safe, you and your families. Take care. Good night. Good night, Colin.